Hello and welcome to the Booked on Planning podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Rouse, Transportation Planner with the Lincoln-Lancaster County Planning Department, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Daniel McKenna Foster, a Senior Planner with the Municipality of Anchorage Planning Department. We're here to get you hooked on planning through the books that have shaped the field. Let's dive in. Our guest today is Sonia Hirt, author of Zoned in the USA. Initially trained as an architect in her hometown of Sofia, Bulgaria, Sonia Hirt holds a master's and doctoral degree in urban environmental planning from the University of Michigan. Prior to joining the University of Georgia, she served as Dean of the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at the University of Maryland in College Park. She was also the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the College of Architecture and Urban Studies at Virginia Tech and Visiting Associate Professor at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. Sonia is the author and co-author of more than 85 scholarly and professional publications with more than 2,500 citations.
Okay. Well, I'm originally from a small country in Eastern Europe, which is called Bulgaria. And I came here in the mid-90s, and my education was in architecture. So my first assignment was to work on renovating old buildings, refurbishing them for apartments in the Midwest. And so one of the first things that I read was a zoning ordinance. And so this was, 30 years ago. And for about 20 years, I couldn't figure out why an American zoning ordinance is so different than what I expected. So I wrote the book because I wanted to satisfy my curiosity. In the countries that I'm familiar with, that is most European countries, the word zoning is actually not used. And what we have is called detailed development regulations, and they're very different than American zoning. And I didn't expect that to be the case. I didn't know anything about it, so it was a surprise. And what was really surprising to me was that in the world, the United States have a reputation that private property is sacred. And in America, as part of freedom, so to say, Americans can do with private property what their hearts desire. Well, I thought that too, because I didn't, I was 25 and I didn't know anything. So a zoning ordinance actually broke for me that stereotype because compared to what I know about how European cities are regulated, it's shockingly restrictive. And so I couldn't make sense in my head. I didn't know how to resolve what seemed to me a paradox between the elevation of private property in the United States and the fact that it's so tightly regulated at the municipal level. So I wrote the book so I could understand. So through studying zoning, I learned about American culture. So I think like most books, there's no difference between the personal and the professional. My personal fascination with, here's a new country for me, I had to make sense of it. And one way I made sense of it is by studying this part of the American experience. So that's why I wrote the book. I can't say that I completely resolved the paradox, but I have at least I formulated some hypotheses, which we can go into detail. And so I educated myself. And I think that's how most professors write. I mean, ultimately, to understand a subject, you either have to teach it or you have to write about it. And in my case, I both wrote about it and I taught it.
It's very interesting. I'm curious. So a lot of communities in the U.S. are looking at form-based codes. Would that be more akin to what you're used to in European countries?
Yeah. So yes and no. So in what ways, yes, and in what ways, no. So European regulations of built form are not as strictly tied to land use. And of course, what is land use? I mean, land use is, well, how we use the land. It doesn't mean anything. But in the United States, and certainly this is the legacy of modernism in Europe and around the world, we associate land use a particular classification system which divides the function of living from the function of from housing, from jobs and services, and from leisure. That's actually, it's not just in the United States, everywhere. But in the European countries that I'm familiar with, there is not, through regulation, a very clear division between home and work. In the United States, if a district is called residential, then they really mean residential. In most cases, these are actually exclusively residential districts, areas of town. And if you really want to make cookies in your kitchen and sell them, of course, you can make the cookies, but it's extremely unlikely that you can open a coffee shop. This is something that is probably is not allowed by your zoning ordinance in this particular district. Not that it doesn't happen, and it happens in downtowns, in centers, and so forth. But in a regular district, which is called single-family residential, it's extremely unlikely that you'll get the permission for that. In European countries, they also use the term residential, but they don't think of it as only living. So having a baker in a residential district would be perfectly part of the main function. So their regulations may address height, they may address how the building is situated next to the street, how much of the lot should be for greenery, which are actually form-based like characteristics. But the clear division that we have in the United States between home and work will not be common to a European, to the point that if you tell them about this, they get surprised, just like I was surprised. So there is a lot of misunderstanding and like inability to comprehend what the other party is even talking about. If you go and you decide, I want to, like I did in my book, I tried to compare American zoning to zoning in Europe, and that even in the countries that are culturally similar, like Britain and Germany. Well, you can't really go to Germany and say, let me see the residential zone, because they don't know what you're talking about. They think you're asking where people live, a residential zone. They don't know that you're talking about the legal construct. They think it's just that the zone is an area, right? I mean, that's what you're asking. Oh, well, the entire city is a residential zone because people live here. So it's like even there is an inability to communicate, even in the countries that actually otherwise are culturally similar. So in this sense, one could say that European cities are more closely regulated based on form. They will still use our categories, but the definitions of the categories would be different, which is why before the book, a few years, usually before you write the book, you write articles. One of the articles that I wrote, the title of the article was actually "The Devil is in the Definitions," because what is residential here is called residential, but it's not the same residential they have there. So that would be one way, I guess, of answering the question. Or another example. So speaking about how property rights are more restricted in a sense. So here, in many cities, you're a planner, so you would know. Now there is a movement to, eliminate, like in Minneapolis, the category of single-family homes. So all they've done is actually allow triplexes to be on the lots where previously it was zoned just for single-family homes. In many cities, as you know, some cities are trying to get accessory housing units in single-family residential districts, and that actually meets a lot of resistance. So in a classic residential zone, exclusive residential zone in the United States, if I want my brother-in-law to build a secondary unit and live there, or to live on my third floor, that actually will not be legal. I have to get some sort of a permission. It is extremely difficult to explain this to a European mind, because they do this all the time. So they don't even think that this is something to be regulated. So here's a paradox. So you're telling me private property rights are important, yet my brother-in-law cannot live here. Well, that is actually a very restrictive imposition on my ability to make my decisions. And of all countries, being new to America in the mid-90s, I was surprised to find it. So this is the paradox that I try to resolve for myself. And I try to make a historical project out of it to understand where it came from and how is it possible that something which is so restrictive on private property actually became such a well-established institution in America. When zoning was started in its early days, 100 years ago, well, it started more than 100 years ago, but the majority of the zoning ordinances spread in about 100 years ago in the United States. It was a very difficult project. Many people thought it will never happen. The greatest experts in America, the lawyers, the housing experts, they believe that this will never happen precisely because it is a very restrictive and Americans would never buy it. To the point where opponents of the whole idea of having zoning actually claimed it to be a form of communism. Because it's so restrictive to private property. I mean, the whole article is written, zoning is communism. And in its historic context, so you're talking about the year 1920, this is after the Bolshevik Revolution, literally proponents of zoning had to write defenses of themselves to American newspapers saying that I've never been to Russia, I don't speak Russian, it's not a Russian idea. Like to, deter criticism. And so how could something that was initially perceived as so anti-American became American? I mean, how did it? And that is how I couldn't figure it out. So I had to write a book about it.
This is, for me, it's one of the most kind of meaningful books I've read as a planner. I read it early on in my career, and it really sort of, I felt like I was able to see beneath the matrix in a way. I spent some years abroad. I even went through Bulgaria. I love Plovdiv and Sofia, and I love the built environment there. And I always wondered why is it so different there than here? And this book answered a lot of the questions for me. And for me, I quote this book all the time. And the kind of passage I always go back to is the one where you say that zoning is a moral geography. If I could, I'll just kind of paraphrase it. You say zoning defines the rules governing what and where people and institutions can and cannot build and operate in our cities, suburbs, and town. By regulating what gets built and where, it sets the basic spatial parameters of where and thus how we live, work, play, socialize, exercise our rights to citizenship. It not only expresses our societal consensus on the correct relationships and categories, it also shapes it. Not only does it tell us what we can and cannot do in certain places, it also cements, both metaphorically and literally, our ideas of the proper categories and relationships that occur in space. In governing our practices, zoning solidifies in our minds what is normal and expected, decent and desirable, thus imposes a moral geography on our cities. I love this passage. And I want to know, in your experience, is this widely understood among professional planners, especially among zoning practitioners? I think they often think, oh, we're just imposing the objective rules. But this to me says, no, this is a moral web. This is all caught up in politics and ideas and virtues and that sort of thing. So in your experience, do people realize this within the field?
Probably not. And I don't mean this in a kind of degrading way. I mean, I think we are taught that, these are technical instruments. I mean, think about this. Who actually, it's just a technical thing, it's just like almost like an engineering project. Categories, of course, you have residential, industrial. I mean, these are basic things, which are not basic. We actually invented them. So I think that there is this assumption because it's a technical instrument, there's an assumption of neutrality, but actually all categories are at some point invented. Darwin invented categories. Mendeleev invented categories. All categories are made up and they reflect something. And even in the sciences, you can say they could be politicized, but certainly when you regulate lifestyle, which is our case here. So I think that there is a perception that this is just a neutral thing, but no, all these ideas are actually, there is nothing obvious about them. They're not anthropologically grounded in our mind. We actually came up with them. And I think that's why comparative research is important, because things that appear normal and routine and unremarkable, if you study their origins or you compare them to something else, then I think you expose the extent to which they are actually culturally loaded. And when I say all those things, I don't mean that American zoning is bad and European land use development regulations are better. They got all kinds of problems in Europe with segregation, lack of affordable housing, anything. It's just that it's different. It's not better or worse. It's not my claim. I just wanted to show that it's different. And the story of zoning is not the story of a technical instrument. It's actually a cultural and a political story. And again, like I say, for me, this was not, I just know about zoning because I went to an architecture school and then I went to urban planning school. If I went to a different kind of school, I would not have written a book about zoning. But I wrote a book about zoning because this is something I know about, and I used it as my window to understand American culture. And I think it's a cultural story. And in that sense, it's also a moral story.
Well, considering the changes in the last few years, with Oregon has a big HB 2001, which really kind of radically reshaped land use, and Minnesota, as you mentioned, and some other places, do you think that American morals or ideas of correct relationships are changing? Is the cultural or political story changing, do you think, or is it still mostly the same?
No, I think it's changing. And so when you asked me the previous question, whether people are aware that we're talking about a moral cultural geography, I think more people are aware today than they were 10 years ago when I actually began writing the book, because it takes about 3 years just to write a book. So I started in 2012, 3 years, 2015. So by all means, and I'm kind of a little bit proud of the book in the sense that now when I give lectures on zoning, I can find all kinds of newspaper titles, the Los Angeles Times, the Minneapolis Star Tribune, and they I literally remember the newspaper titles. They'll say something like this, single family zoning is weird, or, not everywhere, it doesn't exist everywhere. It's like, yeah, exactly my point. And I'm glad to say I did this 10 years ago. So I think not because of my book, but there is a general recognition, and my book was one of the things that kind of, I think, helped the field see that these are very problematic, not in the bad way, issues, but in the sense, the French problématique. I mean, this is like to discuss, to consider. This is not just neutral and obvious. There is nothing obvious about it. It simply was invented. So I think there is a general awareness, yes. But on the other hand, we're not observing, I don't know whether this is a continuation of answering the same question. We're not observing a revolution. We are still observing an evolution. So in Minneapolis, when they're so proud of themselves, and they say, I got interviewed by the Star Tribune a couple of years ago when they were doing that. And they think, oh my God, like what a revolution. We're abolishing single family zoning. Well, you are abolishing single family zoning, fine. But you're now allowing a triplex to count where only a single unit could count. Well, all over Europe, in many countries, they don't even think of it a bit like single versus triplex. They regulate by height. So it's not that revolutionary. And by the way, this is not what the person who interviewed me from the Star Tribune wanted to hear. One can claim that Minneapolis invented single family zoning. I say in the book it's Berkeley, but Berkeley actually was learning from Minneapolis, because in Minneapolis, they came up with the idea of there are a couple of neighborhoods whose names now I can't remember, where really they said that this is just for units for a single family. So, it's kind of peculiar. The very same places that came up with the idea, the progressive cities, so, now California, Minneapolis, sorry to tell you guys, you're the ones who came up with the idea, because 100 years ago, that was the progressive idea. So all you're doing is reversing the things that you invented 100 years ago. So don't go around and be so proud of yourself, because you created the problem to begin with. But anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that there certainly is a step, and there is a step towards form-based zoning, for example, in the city of Miami. But if you really read it very carefully, the fine print, they still have single-family zones. They still are more exclusive than anything you would find in Berlin, because this is just part of the cultural tradition. I'm not saying that it's bad or good. Hey, I live in a single-family home myself. So I had to live the problem to understand it. It's a kind of a self-ethnography, you see. So I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It probably has many wonderful elements of it. People get more privacy, it's more peaceful, whatever. The point is, it's different. It's not a worldwide phenomena. It's actually a unique moment in history and geography that it exists in the form that it does. And yes, people are building awareness, and things are changing, but they are not changing through a revolution, but evolutionary, which is not surprising, because it took nearly 50 years to actually get zoning as an institution in the United States. So it too was evolutionary for some time. And then when the Supreme Court endorsed it in 1926, it took off. So, I mean, why do you expect that this time will be more revolutionary? There is no reason. It's going to change little by little, and that's great. But I think there is more hype than reality. And so we think that, we are really changing the world just because our point of reference is what we had here in the year 1970, as opposed to what exists in other parts of the world. So I guess with my book, what I tried to do is shift the reference point.
Yeah, and at the end of the book, you say, I hope that most Americans no longer subscribe to the implicit theory that underpins zoning, that public institutions should be in the business of enforcing a natural social order. But just your comments about how we're still getting stuck on singleplex or duplex or triplex. Do you think we still kind of have that idea maybe?
So I think, again, it's changing. There is more awareness, but it's not a revolution. And I also think it depends, what do you mean by we? So I think we in planning circles, that's one thing. And I think there is greater awareness and more support for more substantial change. But I think in people who simply are, so to say, they live in their environment, they consume it, if I may use this term. I think most people still prefer to live in a single family home. And this is actually, there is empirical data, and I'm not blaming them for this. I'm just saying that this is a fact. But can I add a little complexity to your story? So from today's point of view, we tend to, the planner's point of view is that zoning is a moral geography, and it really alienates some people, and it's class-based, it's race-based, and all this is true. But I got to speak up for the original zoning advocates too, because I think when you do a lot of research, you understand the story is not simple. So yeah, they believed, and you can find all kinds of quotes of people who said, I just think zoning advocates, Robert Whitten in Atlanta, I think that bankers should live in one neighborhood and, workers should live in another neighborhood. And I think that if we zone it, that everyone would be happy. So obviously they thought that classes should live separately, but it's extremely easy to blame people 100 years later. I'd love to see what people tell us about us here 100 years later too. It's very easy to criticize the past, but there were some very legitimate reasons to want zoning, which I think when we begin critiquing it, by we, I mean planners today, we forget that there are actually some really good elements, and we simply forgot that it was not all about exclusion. In some ways, it was about inclusion. Here's the counter story. All the labor unions at some point embraced zoning. Why? It was a middle class project, because the idea was such: if you're really rich, you're gonna get your family out of town and gonna visit the factory when you can. If somebody builds a factory next to you, you're gonna hire a lawyer, you're gonna take them down. If you're really rich, you're gonna go and live in the community of like-minded people, and you'll never have a factory or a car service place or whatever. You can take care of yourself if you're rich. But what if you're a worker? What if you're a middle-class person? And yes, they didn't think about the lowest categories of people, the poorest people, but at least they thought about the middle class. And the idea was zoning is poor man's law. You see, I have my little home here. I have my little home, and any factory can move here, and I'm not rich and I can't file a lawsuit. Through zoning, you government are actually protecting me, the little owner. So it was about exclusion, but politics is never about one thing. It's never just bad or good. So there was an element of it which was actually very democratic. And I think it's easy to criticize the past, but actually there is more complexity to the past than we see. There are all kinds of perfectly legitimate reasons to think about zoning, and the most obvious one was public health. Well, yeah, it's true. If you have a polluting factory next to you and you're just a middle-class person who can't defend themselves, of course zoning is good for you. But there are other things that we completely have forgotten today. When they passed zoning in New York, a lot of some of the advocacy for zoning was actually based on studies done by the fire department. And I can't verify their numbers. I don't know whether that's true, but I don't see why they would be lying. So they did some data and figured very simple things, that in buildings, multifamily buildings, as most of central, urban New York is, if you have a restaurant, not to mention, there's fire. And actually, it's by far more likely to get harmed by fire if you live above a restaurant than if you don't live above the restaurant. So it was a safety thing. They didn't have fire exits. They didn't have sprinkler systems. So it was a very sincere attempt to actually help people in this way. And there's nothing exclusionary about it. And, it's true. It isn't just it wasn't a project of like, oh my God, let's separate rich and poor and oppress them as much as we can. This is a caricature of their efforts. So a lot of things, it was a complicated project, and for something which was such a how should I say, aberration with American tradition, to get this done, for this to become the political consensus from being a political stepchild, they had to gather many political groups, various constituents to support the project. So another thing, and that's the last thing I say, well, everyone knows in the big cities, especially in New York, in the tenements where really the poor immigrants live, they did a lot of work at home. They made, for example, matches. It's very dangerous to make matches. And what did the wealthy industries decided? Since, well, that's dangerous, I'm not going to have it in the factory. I'm giving it to them in their homes. Let them burn, let them poison themselves with this, whatever it is. So actually, you had to obey some basic safety rules to be in a factory. But if they outsourced the works to the homes, they didn't have to obey any rules. So when you got work out of home, you're actually helping the immigrant family living on the third floor. So this is not exclusionary. This is quite the opposite, but it's an easy story to forget.
Yeah, and it's interesting, just the distinction between zoning codes and building codes. And I think for most people today, at least when they call, I work in a public office, they don't really understand the difference between zoning and building. And that concept of I don't want somebody to build a factory next to my house, it's still very much in the forefront of people's minds. Everybody has the same image of like, they don't want their children playing in the shadow of a smokestack or something. It's almost like this cultural idea, even though I wonder, do you think that building codes have kind of stepped up to fulfill the role that zoning code was maybe initially supposed to do?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of fire safety, actually, we've addressed what originally was addressed through zoning. Simply the most crudest way of solving the problem was to separate work from home. Now we address some of these safety issues through building code, so therefore a zoning solution is no longer necessary. You can't, it's impossible to argue that homes cannot be above a restaurant because this is a safety hazard, but it was. And so again, I'm just trying to say is that, I mean, I didn't know any of those things before I wrote the book. It's all a matter of, that's what research is, you see how much more complex the story is than what you started with. But I guess the reason why I'm bringing these things up is because when I hear a lot of because I feel like I wrote the book and most people who like the book pick up exactly this part that zoning is exclusionary. And that certainly is my point. But my point is also there's a lot of other things going on there. So it's really not helpful to take history and reduce it to something simple just because this is what is appealing today. It just was complicated. It always is. That's what makes history fun.
You know, what's interesting, we recently just did a planned unit development in an older neighborhood in Lincoln and tried to make it, basically we stripped away a lot of the base zoning regulations and tried to make it as easy as possible to do home-based business or your less intense commercial uses right next to the housing and make this very vibrant district. But what we're running into is even though we've basically stripped the zoning out of it, they're running into issues with the building code that they still can't create those kind of neighborhoods because it's too cost prohibitive to add in all the sprinklers, or they still need X amount of feet setback from that next structure because of the windows and all sorts of things. So it's interesting that even if we were to kind of strip away the zoning, that building codes are still an issue.
Sure, and then the financing system, I mean, how loans are given. I mean, obviously other people specialize in this and not me, but there's a layer of institutions that come together to, create an environment, which I suppose most people still find the environment they prefer. If it was vastly unpopular, after all, it would change. But if it's staying and it's changing only evolutionary, then obviously lots of people like it. I'm not blaming them. I'm just saying it is a fact.
Yeah, I've seen that with a lot of ADUs. When I first started working planning, there was no financing available for ADUs. Banks didn't really know how to do it. But in the past few years and attending more conferences, it seems that now banks have finally caught up to that type of product. And of course, California is doing some pretty interesting stuff with long-term financing, or even I think that they're willing to loan based on your future rental income to come from an ADU, which a couple of years ago was sort of unheard of, right?
Yeah. So I think the institutions are moving generally in parallel, maybe some ahead of others. But yeah, I that's the answer to the question. I think, yes, there is an evolutionary movement, just not a revolutionary movement.
There's one, your book, Zone in the USA, led me to another book by Constance Perrin called Everything in Its Place, Social Order and Land Use in America, which I think was written in the 70s. And reading it today, it seems as accurate and on point as ever. I'm just truly amazed by this book, and I'm so glad that your book led me to it. But a lot of that book talks about how the social category of home ownership and preferences and how being a homeowner carries this cultural weight. Since you've kind of been looking at this from your unique perspective, do you think that will ever change, or that kind of will always be a cultural piece of the United States?
So depending what you mean by it, that now I begin to sound like President Clinton. What's the meaning of it? So Okay, so first of all, I love that book and I definitely cite it, and I haven't read it for years. I certainly read it before I wrote my book, and I too was amazed by how, I mean, this book was written really early in like, so I mean, she really came to an awareness well before, me and many of us. So it's really remarkable, everything in its place. And that's actually that was a common expression when they instituted zoning, everything in its place, everything in its place. But this is what I want to say. Zoning has nothing to do with home ownership. Home ownership rates in many countries where there is no zoning is by far higher. Home ownership in China is in the 90%. It has nothing to do with communism, lack of communism. This is all myth and legend. So zoning doesn't really do anything about home ownership. I mean, zoning, it can be as true for rental, whereas they're rental homes. So zoning by itself and home ownership are two completely different things. I mean, I know this is kind of what we talk about ourselves. America is a country of homeowners, but I mean, you've seen this in my book, but I mean, I grew up in Bulgaria, which at the time was part of the communist bloc. Well, home ownership in Bulgaria was higher during communism than it is today in the United States. So the home ownership and zoning, not the same thing. It doesn't promote home ownership. It's just that there is a kind of an association in the United States that you own a single family home, but of course we have condos today. So ownership and housing typology, in my opinion, are just two completely separate phenomena.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the chart, and I think it shows that in 2010, Singapore had the highest rate, and then Spain, then Iceland, Belgium of home ownership, up above 70-80%. Which I think isn't widely known.
This is not widely known. So here's why I think people have an idea that people go around and say that the United States is a home ownership society when only really 65%. It's a 65% ownership society because America was first. So before World War II, at least in the European countries, home ownership really was low. So America became a nation of homeowners before the European countries and before Asian countries. But after World War II, in essence, things reversed. But we kind of carry that older image.
So I'm curious, I think one of your recent papers was on degrowth or shrinkage in legacy cities. I have a friend in Cleveland, and we talk about this a lot. What can you tell us about your work with that, or any other interesting things you've found or upcoming work?
Well, sure. Yeah. Well, I just gave an interview yesterday to the Seattle Times. It was about that paper. So there are people in the United States who really specialize in shrinking cities like I specialize in land use regulation. I'm just not one of them. I can give you many names. I'm not one of them. I had a conversation at a symposium with my co-author, Robert Beauregard, extremely well-regarded professor, retired from Columbia University. And so we decided to write a paper on shrinking cities. This is the only paper I'm going to write on shrinking cities. But again, I like it. It's a little bit of a cultural story for me, and that's why I wrote it. And I'll never be an expert on that. But our point with Bob Beauregard was that, there is this assumption of, that to grow is good and to shrink is bad and almost an embarrassment. But the truth of the matter is that even in the history of the Western world, so not the Western world, thanks, we know, right? Through the Industrial Revolution, growth was terrible. I mean, quality of life in cities did not improve. People were so desperate in the countryside that they were starving, so they had to go to city. But actually, mortality rates were higher in cities than they were in the rural countryside. So growth has a number of problems, and you see it in many countries, in very fast-growing cities in, for example, Southeast Asia. It's not like growth doesn't come with problems. On the contrary, it could be very problematic. And it's not necessarily true that every time population shrinks, we need to panic about it. Quality of life is not necessarily linked to quantity of, at least not of housing. And now we know from the pandemic that you actually could lose residents, but not lose the jobs. It's happening in Seattle, apparently. I learned this from the Seattle Times, because people are not living in the city, but they work in the city. They just work from home. So now Seattle's population is shrinking, and the reporter called me to tell me, like, oh my God, people are thinking it's the end of the world for Seattle. So we again, Bob and I felt that this is like also another cultural myth that necessarily growth is good and shrinkage is bad, but actually that's not the case. Growth could be very bad. And if you play your cards right, when, in a reason, I'm not saying that the city that's going to lose 75% of its population is going to do well, but moderate shrinkage might offer opportunities, less traffic, more green space, who knows, maybe more young people will move, they'll open galleries, will be more experimental. It's what happened in many cities. So maybe it's some benefits. So again, I feel like a lot of things, much of life is based on these kind of assumptions we make that this is right, this is wrong, this is normal, this is routine. And when you begin studying it, it actually turns to be more complicated. So that's why I wrote this paper. And I gave an example to the reporter yesterday. I've been speaking about moral geographies. Is the name, you're in planning, you know who's Frederick Jackson Turner? So Frederick Jackson Turner was an American historian. He wrote in the late 1800s. And he came up with this very innovative project. He also did a comparative project. I love his question. His question is, okay, he didn't think about a lot about the Native Americans. He thought about the white people from Europe. And he was like, I can't understand through what magic do people come from these European countries and they have the same cultural traits as the old countries, and they show up in America and they become Americans. I mean, how do you make Homo Americanus? What is it? And so he said that this is the difference, that Americans, that's his theory, it's very controversial today, but whatever, are exposed to the open frontier that is always retreating, and wave after wave, they never settle. They always fight the frontier. They settle it. They, in his old-fashioned language, that civilize it. And this encounter between, the developed part of the world, and again, he was disregarding Native Americans, and the open frontier, and this impulse for growing is what makes the American and makes the European become an American. And the interesting thing, and the reason why it came to me when I was talking to the reporter yesterday, is that in 1890, the US Census declared that America has now spread from east to west. And they used some statistical standard, like, do you have that many acres of land without a human on them? If you use this standard, in 1890, the census declared the American frontier closed. And Frederick Jackson panicked and said, what would the country be if we have nowhere to grow? I mean, like, we would lose our Americanness, this impulse for growing. And so I think it's a similar thing, just because there is no, look, America survived the last time when there was no more land to the west. So we certainly will survive if our cities shrink a little bit. So I think, again, there is a presumption of growth to be equal to goodness, but it shouldn't be.
Distinctly something very intrinsic in the American character or something. That's really interesting.
But if you don't,
frontiers closed. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, like, imagine the terrible thing. Can I volunteer to tell you about my current project? Because I know that was one of the questions. So, my entire career, I'm still discovering America. I've lived here for half my life, but it's a fascinating country, and I never can get enough of it. And I always have to learn something new. And so I'm now writing another book that I am also trying to discover America. But this is what my current thinking is. So, my degrees are in architecture and urban planning. So these are disciplines that deal with space. And so I've gone to dozens of conferences, and everyone talks about space. But what about time? And there is an American conception of space, but there is also an American conception of time. So let me give you an example of one of my early cultural shocks when I came to the United States. So when you come to the United States, two people meet in the hallway, and then someone says, "How are you?" And then you say, "How are you?" And then you pass. Because people have things to do. They can't dilly-dally and explain. If somebody stops me in Bulgaria and says, "How are you?" I have to stop and for 10 minutes steady complain about the government. That's just cultural norm. Or complain about my love life sometimes, about my children. How are you? How are you? You're in your direction. Time is precious here. We move on. So my book is called America's Hurry, making sense of time and space in my adopted country. And so half the book deals with how I think Americans think about space slightly differently from what I knew. And the other half of the book deals with how I think time is perceived differently. So in one sentence, my observation is that America, which is a land of plenty, people live space rich but time poor. And that's what my book is about. So in 2 years, we can talk about that book.
Very interesting correlation.
Thank you for writing this book. It's been something that I really have enjoyed going back to. I send it out to anybody. Whenever somebody's kind of trying to understand land use planning or zoning, this is the first thing I say is, look, you got to understand, it's kind of a cultural system. This isn't necessary. It's not kind of a technical. You give me a lot of terms today, which would be really helpful. So I appreciate it.
But millions of Americans suffer from insomnia. And I have heard that my book works as a sleeping pill for anyone. So
I don't know about that.
Well, with that, I guess the final question that we always leave with our podcast episodes is, what do you think is the most important thing that our listeners should take away from this episode or your book?
Well, there is no such thing as technical. There is culture behind every policy, behind every instrument that humans create. There is no such thing as a thing that is not culturally based.
I think that's a great way to wrap it. And I really appreciate you joining us today, Sonia. And it's been very